I'll never forget that New Year's Eve. It started out so normal, you know? My wife Emily and I had planned this simple, quiet dinner at home with our best friends, Tom and Rachel. The vibe was great. We had candles lit, music playing softly in the background, and the smell of roasted chicken filling the house. It was one of those nights where everything feels right. Until it didn't. Around 8 p.m., just as Emily was putting the final touches on the table, someone knocked on the door. It startled me, honestly, because we weren't expecting anyone. No deliveries, no neighbors dropping by. It was weird. I peeked through the peephole, and there he was. A guy in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. He was wearing this worn-out jacket and holding a small package. He looked normal enough, but something about him felt off. "I've got a delivery for you," he said, smiling too wide. I remember frowning because we hadn't ordered anything. "You sure?" I asked, not opening the door. "Yeah, this is for you," he said, tapping the box. He sounded patient, but there was this edge to his tone, like he was holding back irritation. Emily came to the door then, and I could tell she didn't feel good about it either. She whispered, "Just tell him to leave it outside." So I told him, "Look man, just leave it on the porch. We'll get it." That's when he stopped smiling. His whole vibe changed. "You need to open the door for this," he said, stepping closer. I froze for a second, but when he put his hand on the doorknob, trying to turn it, instinct kicked in. I shoved the door shut as hard as I could and locked it. He banged on the door a couple of times, and I swear my heart was pounding out of my chest. As soon as we locked the door, the four of us just stood there, staring at it like it was going to fly off its hinges. Emily's hands were trembling, and I could feel my own pulse racing. "Who the hell was that?" Tom asked, his voice low but sharp. None of us had an answer. I mean, how do you explain something like that? A random guy showing up with a package, trying to force his way in? It didn't make sense. We moved to the living room, all of us keeping our voices down like we didn't want him to hear us, even though he was gone, or at least we thought he was. Emily grabbed her phone and called the police. As she explained what happened, I kept looking toward the front window, half expecting to see him lurking out there. But the street was empty, the quiet kind of empty that doesn't feel comforting. The operator told us to stay inside and keep the doors locked until the officers arrived. Easier said than done. Every sound in the house suddenly felt louder. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, even the wind against the windows, it all made my skin crawl. Rachel sat on the couch, hugging her knees, while Tom kept pacing, glancing at his watch every few seconds like the cops were taking too long. I couldn't blame him. Then came the worst part. About 15 minutes after the call, there was another noise. Not a knock this time, but a scraping sound near the side window. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered. I nodded, my mouth dry. Rachel clutched Tom's arm, and he motioned for us to stay put as he crept toward the window to check. But I could see it in his face. He didn't really want to look. Tom leaned toward the window, careful not to touch the blinds. I could see his shoulders tense, and he barely moved. "Do you see anything?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Then he shook his head, slowly, and whispered back no. But I swear I heard something. We all stood there, not daring to move. The sound came again, closer this time. A soft, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled along the side of the house. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might drown out the noise. Emily clutched my arm, her nails digging in. "It's him," she mouthed, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't want to believe it, but what else could it be? We hadn't seen him leave. What if he'd just been waiting, hiding? Rachel whimpered softly, and Tom stepped back from the window. "We need something," he said, his voice shaking. "A bat, a knife, anything." I nodded, but I couldn't seem to move. My feet felt glued to the floor. Then the sound stopped. Just like that. The silence was worse, honestly. At least when there was noise, you knew where he was, or thought you did. Emily started dialing the police again, her voice cracking as she told them about the noise. "Please hurry," she said. "We think he's still here." The silence dragged on like it was daring us to move. Emily was still on the phone, explaining everything to the operator. Tom had grabbed a fireplace poker and was gripping it so hard his knuckles were white. Rachel was huddled on the couch, barely breathing. I kept staring at the window, convinced I'd see something, or someone, any second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the flashing red and blue lights spill across the walls. Relief hit me like a wave, but it didn't last long. The cops knocked on the door, and I practically sprinted to let them in. 2 officers came inside, their hands hovering near their holsters. Another one stayed outside, shining a flashlight along the side of the house. I told them everything while Emily clung to my arm. Tom tried to fill in the details I missed, but honestly, none of us were thinking straight. The officer outside called for the others, and they stepped back out. I followed, even though my legs felt like jelly. He was pointing at the ground near the side window, where we'd heard the scraping noise. There were footprints. Clear ones. They led around the side of the house, stopping right beneath the window. And then, nothing. No trail leading away. No sign of him leaving. Just the prints, deep, heavy, and some scratch marks on the siding, right near the glass. The officer turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You said he knocked on your door first?" I nodded. "And then you pushed him out and locked up?" Another nod. He crouched down, shining the light closer at the scratches. "These weren't made by a tool," he said, almost to himself. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely holding steady. He glanced up, his face dead serious. "They look like they were made by nails. Human nails." The officers eventually left after searching the area and finding nothing else, but their words stayed with us. We sat together in the living room, not saying much, every creak of the house making us flinch. None of us could shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. Even after the sun came up, the fear didn't fade. We never found out who he was, what he wanted, or how he'd vanished without a trace. But every New Year's Eve since, I can't help but glance at the window, half expecting to hear that sound again. It all started with an innocent favor. My coworker, Tom, was heading out of town for New Year's and asked if I could house-sit his apartment. "It's a quiet building, super safe," he'd said. At first, I was thrilled. His place was way nicer than mine, and honestly, I figured I'd just enjoy a free night to relax. By 11 p.m., I was sprawled out on his couch, eating leftover pizza and watching some random movie. The building was so quiet that I could almost hear myself chewing. I'd even laughed earlier when Tom mentioned how boring his neighbors were. "They'll probably all be in bed by 9, he joked. But then, around 11:30, I heard footsteps in the hallway. No big deal, right? People come and go. At first, I didn't even think about it. But then the footsteps stopped. Like, right outside the door. I muted the TV and sat up. For a second, I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe someone was texting, or waiting for an Uber. But then, I heard the doorknob jiggle. Just once. Then again, a little harder, like someone testing if it was locked. My heart shot into my throat. I turned on the living room light but didn't make a sound. My mind was racing. Do I yell? Do I call the cops? What if it's just a neighbor who's drunk or confused? After what felt like forever, the jiggling stopped. A few seconds later, the footsteps started up again, fading down the hall. Around midnight, I'd finally convinced myself it was no big deal. I kept thinking, maybe it really was just some drunk neighbor. Or someone checking the wrong door. I mean, it happens, right? But even as I sat there, pretending to focus on the movie, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like the apartment wasn't mine anymore. I decided to double-check the locks, just in case. Deadbolt, secure, chain, latched, front door locked. Yep. I even peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Just the dim light and a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing against the door. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but every little noise made me jump. The hum of the fridge? Too loud. The floor creaking when I shifted on the couch? Way too loud. And then, just when I started to calm down, I heard it. This faint tapping sound. Not from the hallway. From the window. I froze. The tapping was so soft, like the kind of sound you'd make if you didn't want to be heard. It came again, a little faster this time. I didn't even want to turn my head, but the window was behind me, and every nerve in my body was screaming at me to look. Finally, I worked up the courage and glanced over my shoulder. The blinds were shut, but I could see the faintest shift in the light coming through them, like something, or someone, was just outside. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. My mind was racing. What floor am I on again? Third? Fourth? There's no way someone could be out there, right? Except Tom had mentioned a fire escape. Slowly, I reached for my phone, trying not to make any noise. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I typed out a message to Tom. "Hey, is there any reason someone would be on your fire escape right now?" He didn't answer. I wasn't surprised. It was New Year's Eve, after all. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Then I heard the faintest creak of metal, the kind a fire escape makes when someone shifts their weight on it. I didn't wait for Tom to respond. I dialed 911, keeping my voice low as I whispered to the dispatcher about the noise on the fire escape. I felt like an idiot even saying it out loud. Maybe it was just the wind or a stray cat, but the thought of someone being there wouldn't leave me. As I talked, I crept toward the window. The dispatcher asked if I could see anyone, so I braced myself and slowly pulled the blinds aside. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. But when I looked out, there was nothing. Just the cold, empty fire escape. I was almost ready to chalk it up to paranoia when I noticed something. The fire escape ladder, the one that should have been folded up, was down. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there. The dispatcher said officers were on their way, and I sat back on the couch, trying to keep calm. When they arrived, they did a sweep of the building. That's when I found out the scariest part. It wasn't just me. Someone had tried to break into 3 other apartments in the building that night. The cops didn't catch anyone, but the thought that someone had been climbing the fire escape, checking doors and windows, still freaks me out. Tom got back the next day, and when I told him, he looked just as shaken as I felt. He'd never had anything like that happen before. I don't house sit anymore. New Year's Eve wasn't supposed to be eventful for me. I had just moved into a new apartment a week before, and honestly, I was still living out of boxes. My friends had plans, but I decided to spend the night unpacking and maybe watch the countdown on TV. It was just one of those nights where you plan to be productive and low-key. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing loud banging from the apartment above me. It sounded like someone dragging furniture or maybe dancing a bit too hard. I remember thinking, typical New Year's noise, and ignored it. The weird part. The banging stopped all of a sudden, like someone hit pause on a wild party. That's when I thought I heard voices. Muffled, but definitely there. It wasn't the kind of thing that made me jump. I figured they were arguing or something. People drink too much, it happens. I kept unpacking, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me glance at the ceiling a couple of times. At midnight, I stepped out onto my tiny balcony to watch the fireworks. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My front door was slightly open. I froze for a second, just staring at it. I was sure I had locked it earlier, but there it was, slightly ajar. My brain immediately went into overdrive. Did I forget to lock it? Was someone inside? I grabbed the first thing I could find, a metal desk lamp, and started walking towards the door, my heart pounding like crazy. I checked every inch of the apartment, my hand gripping that lamp so tight my knuckles were white. Nothing seemed out of place. No drawers opened, no boxes moved. That should have been a relief, but when I looked closer at the door, I saw the lock had been messed with. It wasn't just open, it had been tampered with. My hands started shaking. I called the building security, barricaded myself in my bedroom, and waited. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. When security finally showed up, they checked the whole building and came back with no sign of anyone. But then one of the guards mentioned something that made my blood run cold. There were fresh muddy footprints leading from my door to the emergency stairwell. They tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank or someone checking for unlocked doors. That didn't help much. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my bed, lamp still in hand, wide awake. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I called a locksmith to replace every single lock, and I ordered a security camera online. I didn't want to take any chances. The locksmith even said, "Yeah, this lock's definitely been picked." Great. Just what I needed to hear. It's been months since that night, and I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. Was it just a random attempt at burglary, or was someone targeting me specifically? The thought still keeps me up sometimes. Every creak in the middle of the night has me checking the camera footage. I guess I'll never really know, and honestly, that's the scariest part.